Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IT governance webinar on stage 2 of a cyber defense in-depth strategy. This is the second in a series of webinars on cyber defense in depth, and usefully it's looking at the second layer. IT governance as a company is one of a number of companies which makes up the GRC International group of companies, an AIM-listed specialist cybersecurity and data privacy organization. We've been in business some 20 years or so. We now have pushing 200 members of staff. We're a Cyber Essentials certification body, amongst other things. We've had more than 30,000 people go through training courses of one sort or another with us. We're a CREST accredited penetration and incident response service business, and our products and services are designed to integrate across the broad range of governance, risk management, and compliance to enable our clients to deal with the interrelated challenges of both cybersecurity and privacy. It's almost a truism now to recognize that a cybersecurity breach is almost certainly a GDPR or data protection breach, and vice versa. If you have a cybersecurity breach, you've probably been failing to apply the required technical and administrative measures that GDPR requires to protect personal data. And so integrating how you go about building cybersecurity and privacy is a fairly key part for all organizations of ensuring they can deal with today's increasingly complex and exciting challenges. I'm Alan Calder. I'm the founder of IT Governance, a business which I set up 20 years ago to help managements and senior management teams and boards tackle the challenge of what's now called cybersecurity, recognizing that for organizations to be effective in dealing with cybersecurity and privacy, it really does require leadership and direction from the top of the organization. I've written a number of books on the subject, 9 Steps to Success, pocket guides on GDPR, and a host of others around governance and cyber security. Today's webinar, we've got an hour set aside. In total, I'm expecting the presentation to run for about 40 or 45 minutes. We're going to be talking through a number of subjects which together add up to stage 2 of our cyber defense in depth model. I'm sure that you've noticed that you're already on mute. You may find that you have questions that you want to have answered as we go through the webinar. Please do, as the questions occur to you, type them into the chat function in your viewer panel. When you logged on to webinar, you will have seen a viewer panel which has a small bar marked as chat. If you expand that, you'll see a section where you can type in a message. Please do type in any questions or anything else that you want us to deal with. When we come to the Q&A section of the webinar, I'll turn to the chat function and I'll pick up any questions which you've got. I'll share them with the audience, and then assuming that it's within my skill set, I'll give you what I think is a useful answer to that question. So that's the plan for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. I'm going to start by doing a quick recap of the emerging threats and cyber attacks that organizations have to deal with today, the reason why you need cyber defense in depth. We'll look at the protection layer, the protection stage, beginning to build the second layer of defense, and then I'll break down some of the key areas of that and look at cybersecurity training, at pen testing, and a baseline certified security level, and then some practical advice and solutions to help you tackle that. So just to recap, why do we need to be worrying about cyber defense in depth? That more than we've got anti-malware software and we've got a firewall, so we should be safe, shouldn't we? And the reason you need to do that is that the threat landscape has got to be seriously complicated. We have increasingly sophisticated criminals, serious organized crime operating often with the protection of a nation state. Certainly cyber warfare going on. You will have come across many comments, particularly about how Russia, at this point in its war in Ukraine, is looking at cyber warfare, raising its stakes to deal with some of its setbacks on the kinetic battlefield. You see North Korea, which is thought to have earned something in the order of $1 billion in cybercrime over the course of the last 12 months or so. A very good way if you're suffering from international sanctions to make sure that hard cash flows into the economy. You get a similar situation in Iran. But of course, it's not just Iran, North Korea, Russia. Pretty well every country has a cyber warfare capability. And for us organizations trying to trade in that environment, the repercussions, the shockwaves of ongoing cyber war, the belief that critical national infrastructure and other organizations are fair targets at a time of cyber war means that everybody has to be paying extra attention to cyber protection. And of course, the migration to cloud, the digitization projects for many organizations, particularly driven by the pandemic, and now the challenge of operating in today's dispersed environment, means that the attack surface itself has grown very dramatically. And the attack surface exists primarily because of weaknesses in people, in process, and in technology. More and more technology deployed at speed means that people don't have the skills they need to deal with it, means your processes are not capable of handling the kinds of challenges which are occurring. And of course that spreads because if you use a managed service provider, they are vulnerable, your supply chain is vulnerable, cyber criminals see the opportunity to attack organizations on a one-to-many basis where they get into an MSP or a software provider's environment, and they from there can attack all of that organization's clients. Is a much better route to market than simply attacking organizations one by one. And many organizations, frankly, have inadequate governance, risk management, and compliance strategies, which means that senior management is usually not in a position to know what's going on. You find out often too late that there has been a major problem or challenge with a piece of software or in some part of the business, which puts sometimes the survival of the whole organization at stake. Cybercrime damages forecast to increase to $10.5 trillion by 2025. Up from just $3 trillion in 2015, a huge expansion in the impact of cybercrime. And the compliance landscape is changing to reflect that. So the GDPR across the European Union, GDPR in the UK, which the British government is planning to change and amend, but will still be something which is capable of being recognized as adequate by the European Union, cybersecurity regulation, enforcing cybersecurity controls onto critical national infrastructure, the original Network Information Security Directive now being revamped in the European Union, new regulation in the UK, potentially also extending to managed service providers, regulation around instant reporting, enforcing reporting and incidents of paying of ransoms. Something like 50 to 70% of all organizations admits to having had some form of ransomware attack in the last 12 months. So the SEC is producing guidance, which will be more than guidance because it will require organizations to report incidents, that listed organizations to report incidents within probably 72 hours of them occurring. So visibility and transparency becomes a much greater challenge for organizations. You can't afford to be breached because while once upon a time you might have been able to hide it while you dealt with it, increasingly you can't. You have to report it. That's driven by regulators' views that personal information should be, if it's breached, the owners of that data should be made aware of it so they can take steps to protect themselves, and that if organizations are forced to declare breaches, they might collaborate better, they might take steps earlier on to protect themselves. So the drive from regulators is very much about getting our house in order. That's hard to do because there are not enough people who know how to deal with cybersecurity. There's a current workforce gap of about 2.7 million people. We don't see any evidence that that gap is getting smaller. So your challenge is how do you deal with an increasingly complex threat landscape when you've got a an increasingly vulnerable attack surface, compliance pushing you to do something faster, quicker, and you don't have enough people to be able to deal with it. The market's fragmented. There are lots of organizations who provide one little part of the solution, which might help, but isn't going to necessarily help. What you really need is a comprehensive solution that integrates across all of your areas of threat. And you need not to have to rely on cyber insurance, because cyber insurance is simply getting more and more expensive. That is, if you can get it at all. So let me look a bit at the threat landscape. Just a reminder that you've got not just serious organized crime and terrorists, you've got competitors, you've got non-target specific, in other words, activity which simply aimed at a given known vulnerability. You've got hacktivists, you've got, of course, a natural disaster, whether the connecting undersea cable is taken out by a trawler hitting it by mistake or by nation-state activity, doesn't change the fact that suddenly you don't have data availability. So the threat actors, there are a number. They are different levels of sophistication, and their vectors are focused on vulnerabilities in people, in processes, or in technology. And they're deploying malware. They might be attacking you on a website. They could be running a denial of service operation. It could be a social engineering attack, which is designed to take advantage of somebody's weakness. Phishing is a classic example of a social engineering attack. It could be an exploit kit that downloaded in a way that you weren't expecting, which helps a less experienced attacker run an exploit that takes advantage of known vulnerability, extracts data or money, or puts them in the middle of a flow of data where they can divert cash to their own account. It could just be ransomware, the most attractive form of cyber threat now for most cyber criminals, because it really works. And it not only works, you can't access your devices, so you pay a ransom. But then they come back for another go. They tell you need to pay another ransom in order to have them not sell your data. Once you've paid that, then they sell your data. Remember, cyber attackers are scumbags. Their job is not about complying with societal norms or with contracts. Their job is just to extract as much money from you as they possibly can, and that's exactly what they do. They're interested in your intellectual property, payment card data, which they can sell or they can use to carry out fraudulent transactions, personal data, which can be sold or used as part of an attack, money, reputation, all of those are their targets. So, hey, as a simple reality, if you have money, you're trading on the internet, you care about your reputation, you have intellectual property, if you have any of the targets which cyber criminals are after, you are likely to be attacked. And if you think you're not vulnerable, it's because you're not paying enough attention. It's a truism to recognize that organizations that think they haven't been hacked, it's simply because they're not looking closely enough. So that's the reality of what we're dealing with. And the only way to deal with it is a defense in depth strategy. Your first line of defense, which you may recall, is a combination of continual vulnerability scanning to make sure that known vulnerabilities in your internet-facing assets have been identified and patched. It's phishing training for staff, making sure that they're going to identify social engineering type attacks and protect against that. That's going to get breached. Sooner or later, it's going to get breached. So you need a second line of defense that enables you to deal with it. You need the right technical administrative controls. You're going to need a third line of defense. So the second line is about protecting assets. The third and fourth and fifth lines, which we'll look at in later webinars, are about a increasingly mature and increasingly resilient line of defense. But today is about the second layer, protection. What happens when that first outward bound detect and attack set of defenses is breached? They get through it. How do you make sure that you're protecting your core assets? And this slide gives you the 5 layers of defense. The second stage is recognizing that things like a zero-day attack, something which the attacker has the vendor, the software vendor, doesn't yet have a patch which they can download for it, or in the case of many organizations, even if the patch is available, they haven't downloaded the patch and installed it yet for multiple reasons, including could be old software. But zero-day attacks with well-designed phishing emails that nobody's seen before, and phishing emails get more and more sophisticated. You've got to put in place a second layer of defense that's going to be more robust, that will ensure you've got appropriately trained staff that will manage cybersecurity defenses and breaches. So, what are those? Employers a crucial line of defense, ensuring they know their security responsibilities, including in terms of incident response, is essential. That's the first element. In level 2, the second is penetration testing, making sure that vulnerabilities that could be exploited are not there. So it's not just about there's a known vulnerability, it's about is there a possibility for a cross-site scripting attack on a website, for instance. And then basic certification schemes that can protect your organization from some of the most common cyber threats, and demonstrate to clients and stakeholders that you have at least a basic or a foundational commitment to cyber security. So those are the 3 elements of your second level of defense. Hey, why do you need them? Because starting with staff don't always do what they should do. It might be because they don't know. It might be because they are they like to find their own solutions to problems. It might be because they just don't listen. But technical solutions mostly are reactive. So a technical solution that's going to respond to a phishing attack is really only going to be effective at that if the phishing attack occurs. It's going to try and deal with the consequences. But it won't identify an entirety of phishing type emails. You're not going to find them by doing anything other than stopping every single email coming into the organization. So phishing emails are going to get through, they're going to reach people, people are going to click on links. You need to have some method, not only of teaching them what the most common phishing emails look like, but you need to teach them to be more aware of cybersecurity genuinely. You need to have people across the organization who have at least foundational knowledge around cybersecurity. But it's not enough just simply to train staff. You need to make sure that they are going to be able to respond. So you should ally all of your training with some testing. So if you rolled out a phishing staff awareness training program, very good thing to do, you should test it. You should engage an organization like us to run a simulation of a phishing attack, which would deploy phishing emails into the organization, which would encourage people to click on them, but all of the clicks would be captured in a safe environment. And over a period of time, the combination of repeating training, updating training with quarterly updates, perhaps to recognize changes in the phishing environment, combined with ongoing anti-phishing simulation, can give you a noticeable, measurable decline in that vulnerability. So staff awareness training, as part of a broader staff training program, identifying what your crown jewels are, what sensitive information you've got that's likely to be accessed by cyber criminals or by people internally that shouldn't. Think about how those critical information is going to be used across the organization. Take account of each of those, make a note of the knowledge and skills that are required to stay secure. Of course, you should be doing that anyway, identifying where information is held as part of your Article 30 compliance for GDPR, but you need to know what your critical information is before you can protect it, and then you need to work out how you're going to protect it, what competences do you need in your staff. And so what you teach your staff and how those lessons are delivered will depend on what they need to know. You need to look at not only what skills they need, but how you're going to deploy them. Is it going to be through an e-learning staff awareness program? Is it going to be an instructor-led classroom course delivered perhaps online or in a physical classroom? Is it going to be a self-paced distance learning type of course? Or is it going to be an in-house training course where you have a number of people trained on a specific subject? But you need to think about how you're going to train the staff sets, what do they need to learn, how are you going to deliver it, and then it's about measuring effectiveness. Informal tests or interviews is certainly one way of doing that, but mostly, particularly with professional courses, you would typically want to end with a formal exam and some form of accredited certification. And the expectation would be that staff attending those training courses would come away with a certification, which of course not only tells you they've paid attention in the past, but is a good part of their own career development and measuring their own career development. At your second layer of defense, there are 3 critical forms of training you need for certainly your technology security team for frontline managers. That's the Cybersecurity Foundation course. It's a one-day training course that looks at all of the key elements of running a secure organization. The GDPR Foundation course does the same. It looks at all of the key elements of GDPR compliance. And Cyber Incident Response, again, a one-day course, looks at how you should structure an incident response process. An incident response is the key recognition that you're going to have a breach. What you want people to do is when they do something they shouldn't, click on a link that they shouldn't, download some malware they shouldn't, you want them to own up fast. You don't want them to hide it and hope it goes away, because every minute is critical. If you download phishing, if you click on a phishing email link, download malware, every minute it's got to propagate is taking you closer to a disaster. So you want people trained to go, shouldn't have done that. How do I respond? I know how to respond. I know how to contact help desk, whoever it is that deals with it. You have a couple of pre-tested, you've worked out and you pre-test and you make sure that your responses really work. And Cyber Incident Response training course takes you in a very instructive day through how to deal with putting in place a cyber incident response framework. So 3 key elements of training. These are training courses which are ideal for very small organizations as well as for large organizations. Often a small organization will get the key knowledge that they need for frontline staff from a combination of these 3 training courses. In a larger organization, these 3 courses would be the foundation of what you build into your 3rd and 4th layers of cyber defense in depth. So that's the first, staff training, making sure that you go beyond just simple phishing awareness into actual competence around cybersecurity, data protection, and incident response. The second component of that second level of defense is penetration testing. So continual vulnerability scanning is simply running scans on a regular, maybe daily basis across your internet-facing infrastructure. It'll identify known vulnerabilities and flag them for you to deal with them. Penetration testing goes significantly further than that. Penetration testing will aim to identify flaws that could be exploited potentially at a later date. So it'll certainly identify items picked up by a vulnerability scan, but penetration testing should go further than that. It'll identify security flaws. It will identify that you've got hardware that hasn't been updated, for instance. It will make sure your existing security controls are effective. Could test new software and systems for bugs, could find new bugs in existing software. Will certainly support compliance with GDPR and other regulatory compliance. It'll help conformance to standards like PCI, and running penetration tests will give your customers, other stakeholders, a sense of a robust approach to cybersecurity management. And there are a number of types of penetration testing, whereas vulnerability scanning is simply a continual process aimed at a number of IP addresses. Penetration testing breaks down into half a dozen different types of testing. So web application penetration test is looking at essentially your website, but any applications which are hosted in the cloud, providing services to customers, making sure that the web browser is securely configured, making sure any vulnerabilities that could be exploited are closed down, looking at web server and database server security, assessing web applications for vulnerability to attacks, including the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities. Massive migration to the cloud, particularly through the pandemic years, meant that many organizations with inadequate knowledge of how to configure cloud environments securely are now in the cloud. Wonderful bonanza for cyber criminals. Cloud configuration is not as simple as it's all in the cloud, I'm safe. You need to configure it securely. You might have a penetration test at a more mature level. You might be training your own technology team on how to deploy cloud configuration skills. You could test the network itself. So external and internal penetration tests are designed to find gaps in the network, gaps that could be exploited by an insider, as well as gaps that could be exploited by an outsider, looking at firewalls, at wireless access points, looking for the particular vulnerabilities that can occur in those environments, and giving you reports that enable you to close those down. For a PCI environment, if you're processing payment cards, you're supposed to be complying with the PCI standard. Penetration testing, very specific set of requirements around making sure that your cardholder data is appropriately segmented. You've got the right authentication services, that known vulnerabilities in particular configurations are dealt with. So it's part of demonstrating your PCI compliance. And it can go on. So you can have penetration tests done which are specifically designed to evaluate how susceptible your employees are to social engineering attacks, which could be carried out by a combination of email and telephone call, could be somebody physically breaking into the environment, or some combination of those designed to make sure that your cybersecurity environment is robust and able to deal with combination attacks. Phishing penetration tests, as I said, simulating phishing attacks, preferably carried out on multiple occasions so you can measure improvement from one test to the next. Testing your cloud configuration, given what I was saying earlier on about organizations that have migrated to cloud having significant vulnerabilities, cloud configuration penetration tests will look specifically at those. We'll look at vulnerabilities and weaknesses in those environments and tell you how you can go about testing them. And of course, finally, remote access. Particularly if you have lots of people working from home, you might look at testing those environments specifically. You're looking for inadequate authentication, weak configurations. You're looking for routers which are still using default settings, outdated software in local environments. All of those things you should be specifically looking for, because if an attacker can get into your network via a remote worker, it's just as bad as if they get in via your own network. So a range of possible penetration tests which you can, talking to an experienced organization, determine what's appropriate for your organization, schedule it in a way that enables it to be carried out, and deliver a report which identifies what the vulnerabilities are and gives you key guidance on how to address them and make sure they go away. As I said, penetration testing isn't just a good thing to do, it's also part of a number of compliance requirements. So it's required by the PCI data security standard. It's an organizational requirement under GDPR, so organizations have to have, under Article 32, a process for regularly testing, assessing, and evaluating the effectiveness of technical and organizational measures for ensuring the safety and the security of processing. And the only way to test and assess the effectiveness of technical measures is by penetration testing, and to find out whether somebody, an experienced attacker, can breach them. ISO 27001, increasingly the key cybersecurity management standard, in Control Objective A12.6 says that information and technical vulnerabilities of information systems should be tested on a regular basis, and that's a very straightforward thing to do. The Payment Services Directive requires payment institutions to have a security policy document, including a detailed risk assessment. New York Department of Financial Services is a final example to demonstrate this is not just in the UK or the EU that you have these requirements, but it's global. The requirement to test internet-facing devices and systems to make sure that they are genuinely secure is a key expectation now of regulators as well as of customers and of stakeholders. And then the third element of an effective defense in depth framework is to look at certification schemes. And we'll talk about more complex certification schemes at later points, but from a second layer of defense perspective, it's Cyber Essentials certification. It's a standard which has been developed by the UK government. You can apply for it from outside the UK. It's not there isn't a barrier, but it's a UK government certification. Certification bodies are accredited by an organization called IASME. We're a certification body, IT governance certification body. And what Cyber Essentials does, it's got two different levels. The first is a basic self-assessment questionnaire, and the second is a more advanced questionnaire which includes a set of external security tests. It's a good foundation for basic cyber hygiene. It can be applied to organizations of all sizes. Admittedly, it tends to be small organizations that deal with cyber essentials only, and slightly larger organizations which will make a point of moving on from cyber essentials to cyber essentials. Plus, we would say all organizations should do cyber essentials plus. And the 5 areas of technical, these are primarily technical controls that organizations should be dealing with. You should be dealing with these anyway. They will help protect you against something in the order of 80% or so of internet-borne attacks. The first is protecting against vulnerabilities by keeping all devices and applications up to date. So that's downloading software updates as they become available, making sure not only that you patch software, but that you update software as it moves out of support. Some of the major cyber attacks over the last few years have taken advantage of organizations running software which is no longer being patched, no longer in support. Very easy for an attacker to take advantage of. So that's the first key control for cyber essentials. The second is around firewalls and routers, making sure that there is a genuine buffer zone between your IT network and other external networks that enables incoming traffic to be analyzed to make sure whether it should be allowed into the network. And mostly this is done automatically. You don't need somebody manually reviewing it. You've got too much data coming in and out to do that. But properly configured firewalls and routers will reduce very substantially the volume of illegitimate, illegal, and frankly dangerous traffic which is trying to come into your network. But traffic's going to come into your network, and so the next thing you need to be doing is looking at access control. Determine what access administrator accounts have to data and services. Make sure that not only do you have very specific roles identified that can have access to specific assets, but that you train those people appropriately so they know how to protect their passwords. People don't use administrator and local administrator accounts, for instance, as part of their day-to-day activity because they will be taken advantage of. So access control is the third key cyber essentials control. The fourth is secure configuration, making sure that devices and software are correctly and securely configured. And configuration is about making sure that you've got the right password practices, that you remove any optional elements in the software that you don't need, but which, if they're unused and they still have their default settings, would enable an attacker to take advantage of them. Remember, attackers are smart. They know what the default settings are in software, as in hardware. They know what the default password for a router is, for instance, when it's shipped out to hundreds of thousands or millions of people around the world. So it's very easy if they want to log on to a router to start off by using the known default password. Easy to make sure that the way you configure software is to preclude the use of well-known passwords like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or QWERTY, any one of those. Half a dozen passwords which every hacker knows and runs as the first half dozen in their automated brute force attack. So secure configuration is the fourth of the controls. And the fifth is malware protection, making sure that you've got anti-malware or anti-virus software deployed that's properly configured, that only allows trusted applications to reach into the network. And you want anti-malware software that is updated probably once a day, maybe 2 or 3 times a day, because remember, new malware, new viruses are being identified all the time. And what you want to be doing is protecting your network against the recently identified stuff that hackers and attackers are rolling out. As I said, while you've got 0 days, you've got attackers using newly discovered malware, newly discovered vulnerabilities, you've also got attackers who recognize that lots of organizations haven't yet been bothered to install the old patches, haven't yet upgraded their software. So across the entire spectrum, you have attacks going on. And we often see clients being attacked 2 or 3 times in the same 5 or 10 minutes by 2 or 3 different attackers, because that happens to be the attack of the day. Most attackers are operating these days here as organized crime with affiliates, and you'll often get affiliates who are using the same software, and they'll go looking for the same vulnerabilities and attacking. So you need to be thinking about how you can deal with those. And Cyber Essentials, which, as I said, will force you to look at improving your controls, is a really good way to do that. And so just summarizing all of those areas, the second layer of defense, you need to be thinking about staff awareness training. Phishing staff awareness course is probably the key one to be thinking about. There's a link in this slide. We'll be sending the slides out together with a recording of the webinar in the course of tomorrow. But phishing staff awareness, you want staff awareness training which is updated at least on a quarterly basis. The reality is that phishing is getting more and more sophisticated. You need to train staff on what the most current attacks look like so that they're aware of what's happening today, not what happened a year ago. You need to be getting staff to repeat the staff awareness training on a quarterly basis. Whole range of industry recognized qualifications. We have a very substantial portfolio of training, certainly foundational training on cybersecurity, on incident response management, and on GDPR. And we'll talk about this later on in other webinars, a broader range of courses, all of them designed to integrate one with another in a very solid integrated portfolio. We're a CREST accredited penetration testing organization, so we can carry out any one of or any combination of penetration tests that you need. Many of them we just do so many of, they just come straight off the shelf, very straightforward, executed well with really good, clear to read, clear to follow reports that give you guidance on how to go about dealing with those penetration tests. And of course, we're a Cyber Essentials certification body. We originated packages which have now become fairly common in the industry. So get a little help, get a lot of help packages, which is designed to make it as easy as possible for organizations, particularly those who've never done Cyber Essentials before. And organizations increasingly are expected to comply with Cyber Essentials by customers. Certainly, if you're bidding for a government contract, you have to have a Cyber Essentials certification. And you need usually to be tackling all of these things simultaneously. So, as I said, if you're thinking firmly about your second line of defense, you want to be thinking about how you can deploy a combination of these services and solutions into your environment to protect yourself. And as I said, all of these are appropriate for small businesses with 2 to 20 employees. You just simply need a broader, more robust deployment if you have 20 plus employees. But the reality is your second line of defense is critical. Your first line of defense has to be there, but it's going to be breached. Your second line of defense gives you a reasonable prospect of surviving. Most breaches take something like 6 months before they're discovered. They take 6 months or more to deal with once they are discovered. Many organizations never fully recover. And just give you a kind of macro picture of what it can look like if you fail to defend properly. The Irish Health Service suffered a cyber attack. They're now pushing 50 million euros to repair and recover from the ransomware attack. They decided not to pay the ransom. 50 million euros so far on recovery. On top of that, they've had to spend now approaching 9 million euros to build the defenses, which if they'd had them in place in the first instance, might have helped them avoid spending 50 million euros to recover. So the message is, if you have a breach, you're going to have to spend money on recovering from the breach, and you're still going to have to spend money on making sure it doesn't happen again. So the sensible thing for organizations to do is spend the money now. You can think of it as a down payment on a future that doesn't involve spending very large amounts of cash suddenly at short notice to recover from a major attack, which also has a big impact on your reputation and on your customers and on your long-term future. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the second layer in your cyber defense in-depth solution. For those of you who have questions, please, as I said earlier, do go to the chat function. If you have any questions, type them into the chat box, and I'll pick up any questions that you have, that come up. Then I'll share the question with you, and then I will tell you what I think the answer is. So in the compliance landscape, we haven't talked about the new DORA regulation coming in next year. Yes, there is probably going to be cyber impact in that. We'll talk more about it as we get greater clarity about what the requirements are going to look like. As you know, EU regulation has a fairly extensive, complicated process to go through, and we'll certainly be doing a series of webinars on DORA for everybody who's interested in how to deal with the cybersecurity and privacy implications of that as it emerges. Second question, what are common software that are exploited for not being kept up to date? Well, every piece of software, and you could start with a Microsoft or Linux environment, is in need of patches. If I just take a parallel, if you have an Apple device, a mobile phone or iPad, you'll be aware that at least every month there is a set of software updates that you're forced to deploy. Those software updates typically involve a number of patches for vulnerabilities which have been identified in your mobile phone, in your iPad, or in your iWatch. You see exactly the same with Google devices. You see exactly the same with Microsoft. Microsoft sends out a monthly set of patches. All of those are patching vulnerabilities in the whole suite of Microsoft software. You find the same across all other software. And the reality is the software is complex. It's written as well as developers can. It's rolled out. And it's only with increasing use and with attacks by attackers looking for it that vulnerabilities are identified, and it has to be patched, and those patches are rolled out. So I'd say the simple answer to what software has patches, what software has vulnerabilities is all software has vulnerabilities. And you need to think about your operating system. You need to think about software that you have on your devices for receiving email. You need to think about browsers. You need to think about any software that you're using in order to transact in money terms, to move data around, to collect information. It all has vulnerabilities. It all needs to be dealt with. Should IT staff with privileged domain admin accounts, not their day-to-day account, be allowed to access the internet from a server? And the answer is that it depends. What you want to have happen is that internal local admin or administrator accounts are used sparingly as possible, and preferably used only inside the network. There are times when it might be necessary for somebody to reach out using that account, but ideally they shouldn't. You want to limit the opportunities for any kind of interception possible. But you know, if you're reaching out into a known destination through a VPN from a server that you can control, you probably manage the risk. But you know, as with all things, you want to be sure that you're able to operate as a business. Managing cyber risk isn't about eliminating cyber risk. That's impossible to do. What you should be doing is being clear about what the risks are and enabling yourself to manage them effectively. We'll talk more about a risk management approach to cyber defense in depth at our third webinar, when we're looking at your third layer of defense, which is really about building robustness into everything that you do. And that at the moment looks like the totality of questions. So if there's any final questions, please do grab this opportunity to post them into the chat function or the Q&A function, which we'll pick up and then share. But in the absence of any such questions, thank you, and lots of ways that you can contact us through our US website, our EU website, or our UK website. The full range of cyber defense in-depth solutions are available to you wherever you are in the world. We look forward to helping you stay secure and compliant with privacy and cybersecurity regulation. And please do join us on the third of these webinars coming up in due course around the third layer in a cyber defense in-depth environment. So thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. I'd like to wish you all a safe and secure Wednesday. Bye-bye.